Not completely, of course. Humanity still existed, still traded across 100 star systems, still sent its freighters and cargo haulers through the deep lanes between worlds. But the fear was gone, and that was the part that mattered. 200 years had passed since humanity first stepped onto the galactic stage, and in that time, the other species had slowly, quietly decided that humans were nothing special. Clever enough to survive, tough enough to be useful, but nowhere near dangerous enough to worry about. The Drawl had their armored hides and crushing strength. The Rithians had their blinding speed and razor claws. The Korvathi had their psychic networks and political empires that stretched across entire sectors. Soft skin, average size, no venom, no armor, no natural weapons worth mentioning on a galactic scale. They were listed as Tier 4 on the Galactic Threat Index. Low moderate, cooperative. Right between the Velmi, who were a gentle insectoid species that barely reached 4 feet tall, and the Gorath, who were large but peaceful by nature. Nobody feared humans anymore. And on Station Cathara 9, a sprawling trade hub orbiting a dying orange star at the edge of contested space, that fact was as obvious as the rust on the station walls. The Fractured Nebula was the kind of bar that existed on every station in every corner of the galaxy. Dark, loud, filled with smoke from a dozen different species burning a dozen different substances, and operating under one unspoken rule. Whatever happens inside, stays inside, because station security took 20 minutes to respond, and everyone knew it. Tillus worked behind the bar, moving quickly on 6 thin legs, his bioluminescent skin shining in the low light, pulsing soft blue and green as he poured drinks and wiped down surfaces, and tried very hard not to look at the table near the entrance, where Gorvek and his crew had been sitting for 3 hours. Tilas was Velmi, small, delicate, with compound eyes that caught every flicker of movement in the room, and right now, every flicker of movement near that table made his light dim with anxiety. Gorvek was Drawl, and everything about him was built for violence. 8 feet of scaled muscle, a jaw that could bite through ship hull plating, claws that left grooves in metal when he gripped his drinking cup too hard, which he always did, because Drawl did everything too hard. He had 7 crew members with him, all Drawl, all mercenaries who had been running a protection racket on the station for the past 3 weeks, shaking down traders, demanding docking fees that went straight into their pockets, threatening anyone who complained with the kind of casual brutality that came naturally to a species that settled most disputes by breaking bones. Station security had filed reports, and the reports had gone to the sector authority, and the sector authority had filed more reports, and nothing had changed, because nothing ever changed on stations like Cathara 9. In the far corner of the bar, away from the noise and the smoke and the tension, a human sat alone in a booth with a glass of whiskey she had brought from her own ship. Her name was Mara Ihejerica, and she was 46 years old, and she had the kind of face that had seen enough to stop being surprised by anything. Calm, dark eyes, a jaw that was set in a permanent expression of quiet patience, and scars on her hands and forearms that told a story she never bothered to tell anyone. She was a cargo hauler now, running medical supplies to fringe colonies on the outer rim, and she had stopped at Cathara 9 to refuel and resupply, and maybe drink 1 glass of something that reminded her of home. Moved on. Nobody in the bar paid attention to her, and that was fine with her, because Mara had never been the kind of person who needed attention. At the large table near the window, Ambassador Sithon of the Korvathi Diplomatic Corps was conducting what he called informal trade discussions, which meant he was drinking expensive wine and making other species feel small, while his aides took notes on datapads. Sithon was elegant in the way all Korvathi were. 7 feet of smooth serpentine body, iridescent scales that shifted color with his mood, and a voice like silk being pulled over glass. And he carried himself with the absolute certainty that his species was the most important in any room they entered. One of his aides, A younger Korvathi named Pelith glanced across the bar at Mara and leaned toward the ambassador. "Human," Pelith said, the word carrying a faint note of academic curiosity, like someone pointing out an unusual, but ultimately, intelligent question. "Unimpressive bird." Sithan barely looked up from his wine. "They are everywhere these days," he said, "like background noise. Useful for shipping and minor engineering work, I suppose, but hardly worth noting." Pelith pulled up something on his datapad and smiled in the thin-lipped way that Korvathi smiled when they found something amusing. Endurance predators, they called themselves once. Can you imagine? They used to chase animals across entire continents until the animals collapsed from exhaustion, and they considered this a point of pride. "Quaint," Scython said. "They barely register on the Galactic Threat Index anymore," Pelith added, and both of them shared a quiet laugh that they did not bother to hide. Mara heard every word. She took a sip of her whiskey and said nothing, because saying nothing was almost always the smarter choice, and Mara had learned a long time ago to save her energy for moments that actually mattered. The moment that mattered came 20 minutes later. Gorvek had apparently decided that drinking was no longer entertaining enough, and he stood up from his table with the kind of heavy, deliberate movement that made the floor vibrate, and he walked toward the bar where a small group of Velni traders had been quietly trying to finish their drinks and leave without being noticed. "Docking tribute," Gorvek said, was the sound of rocks grinding together in a machine. The Velni traders looked at each other with their compound eyes flickering in panic, their bioluminescence flashing the rapid amber that meant fear, and the oldest among them held up his hands and said that they had already paid the station fees and had nothing else to give. Gorvek leaned down until his massive scaled face was inches from the old Velni, and suggested that perhaps they should find something else to give, because he was not in a patient mood. Tillis moved out from behind the bar before he even realized what he was doing, his body acting on instinct, on the deep Velni need to protect his own kind that overrode every rational thought telling him to stay where it was safe. "Please," Tillis said, stepping between Gorvek and the traders, his small frame trembling, his light pulsing desperate white. "They are just merchants. They have nothing for you. Please just let them go." End of sound. Little bartender, the way a mountain looks down at a pebble. Then he backhanded Tillis across the face with one massive clawed hand, and the Velni flew sideways through the air, and hit the far wall, and crumpled to the floor, his bioluminescence flickering and dimming like a candle caught in a storm. The bar went silent. Every species, every patron, every pair and set and cluster of eyes in the room turned and looked, and saw the small broken shape on the floor. And then they looked at their drinks, or at the walls, or at their own hands, and nobody moved, and nobody spoke, because this was the way things worked on stations like Kethara 9, and everybody knew the rules. Mara set her glass down. The whiskey was finished anyway. Tillis lay on the floor, and the light inside him was dying. Not the life, not yet, but the glow that lived under his skin, the soft pulse of color that every Velni carried from birth to death, the light that told the world what they felt and who they were. That light was flickering in broken patterns of gray and pale amber, and every Velni in the bar knew what that meant. It meant pain so deep it was shutting things down. It meant the small bartender, who had never hurt anyone in his life, was lying on a cold metal floor with a fractured jaw and cracked chitin plates along the left side of his face. And nobody was helping him, because Gorvek was still standing in the middle of the room, and Gorvek was still looking for money. The droll mercenary turned back to the Velni traders and spread his massive arms wide, claws catching the light, and he grinned with a mouthful of teeth that were each the size of a human finger. "Anyone else want to talk about what is?" "Fair?" he asked. Nobody answered. The Korvathi delegation at their table did what Korvathi always did when violence happened near them. They pretended it was not their concern, because getting involved in the affairs of lesser species was beneath their diplomatic standing. And Ambassador Scythan made a small note on his datapad and reached for his wine without looking up. A Gorath trader near the door quietly stood and left, his forearms held close to his body, eyes fixed on the exit. Two Rithian pilots at a side table exchanged glances and then looked away, because even Rithians, fast and deadly as they were, did not pick fights with 7 Drawl over a bartender they did not know. This was the math that the galaxy ran on. Calculate the risk, weigh the cost, determine if the outcome was worth the damage, and if the answer was no, then look away and let it happen, and tell yourself that someone else would handle it eventually. Mara Ihajirika did not run that kind of math, P. She stood up from her booth, and the motion was so quiet and so unremarkable that at first nobody noticed. Just a human woman of average height, pushing back from a table, stepping around a chair, walking across a dirty bar floor toward a broken body on the ground. She knelt beside Telis. Her hands moved with a kind of muscle memory that had nothing to do with fighting, fingers checking for fractures along the Velny's facial plates. 2 fingers pressed gently against the pulse point beneath his lower jaw, where Velny carried their heartbeat close to the surface. One hand stabilizing his neck, because she knew that Velny's spinal structures were fragile, and a fall like that could have shifted something dangerous. Telis opened his compound eyes and looked up at her, and his light pulsed a weak and confused blue. "You are going to be okay," Mara said, and her voice was low and calm, and carried the weight of someone who had said those exact words 1,000 times before to people in far worse condition. "Your jaw is fractured, but it is clean. Do not try to talk, do not try to move, just breathe." She had been a combat medic once, Sergeant Mara Ihijirika, 4th Terran Expeditionary Medical Corps, 12 years of service on 6 different worlds, 3 combat deployments, and more field surgeries than she could count. And the instinct to treat the wounded, before doing anything else, was so deep in her bones that it came before anger, before fear, before the cold calculation of what was about to happen next. The bar watched, Gorvek watched, and something shifted in the room. Something small and hard to name, but impossible to miss. Because every species in that bar had seen violence before, had seen people get hurt, had seen bystanders do nothing. But very few of them had ever seen someone walk toward the danger, to kneel beside the broken, and check their injuries with gentle hands, before even acknowledging the threat. Such a human thing to do, and it was the first time most of them had really noticed. Mara looked up at Gorvek. She did not stand, not yet. She just looked up at him from where she knelt beside Tillis, and her dark eyes were steady and calm and completely without fear. And that was the thing that made Gorvek's grin falter for just a fraction of a second, because fear was the currency he traded in, and this human was not paying. "You are done here," Mara said. "Take your crew and walk out, and do not come back to this bar." Gorvek stared at her. Then he laughed, a deep rumbling sound that vibrated the glasses on the bar, and he looked around at his crew, and they laughed too, because this was genuinely funny to them, this small soft-skinned creature kneeling on the floor, telling 8 Drawl mercenaries to leave. "Has anyone here," Gorvek said to the room at large, spreading his clawed hands like a performer addressing an audience, "ever actually seen a human fight?" Peleth, the Korvathi aide, smirked from his table and shook his head. A Rithian pilot snorted. Someone in the back of the bar actually chuckled. Gorvek looked down at Mara, the way he had looked down at Telis, the way a mountain looks at something it is about to bury. "Go back to your corner, little human," he said, "before I add you to the floor." Mara stood up. It was a simple motion, just a woman rising from a kneeling position. But something about the way she did it made the laughter in the room die in a few throats. Because she rose, the way a coiled spring unwinds, with a kind of controlled, mechanical precision that spoke of years of training her body to move exactly where she told it to move, and nowhere else. She was shorter than Gorvek by more than 2 feet, and lighter by more than 300 pounds, and she had no armor, and no claws, and no scales, and she was standing in front of him with nothing but her bare hands. Her eyes that Gorvek had never seen before, from a species he had always considered prey. "I am not going back to my corner," she said. Gorvek swung. It was a fast swing for a drawl, a sweeping backhand with claws extended, the same strike that had sent Tillus flying, the kind of blow that could crack stone and bend metal and turn soft tissue into wreckage. And it was aimed directly at Mara's head. She was not there when it arrived. Mara moved the way water moves around a rock, not backward, not away, but sideways and forward and under, her body dropping and rotating in a motion that was so practiced and so deeply embedded in her muscles that she did not even think about it, the same way she did not think about breathing. Gorvek's arm passed over her head, and she was already inside his reach, her hands finding his wrist and elbow, her body turning into a fulcrum that used his own massive momentum against him, and the 8-foot wall of scaled muscle went forward and down with a sound like a shuttle crash as his face met the edge of the bar counter. The impact cracked the counter. The entire bar shook. Mara had his arm locked behind his back, at an angle that made the joint creak and groan under pressure it was never designed to handle, and she held it there with both hands and the weight of her entire body. And Gorvek roared in pain and surprise and a sudden unfamiliar emotion that it took him a full second to recognize as genuine alarm. The bar went silent again. But this silence was different from the first one. The first silence had been the quiet of people looking away from something ugly, the silence of shame and acceptance and surrender. This silence was the sound of an entire room holding its breath. Ambassador Sithon's wineglass stopped halfway to his mouth. Pellet's datapad slipped from his fingers and clattered on the table. The 2 Rithian pilots leaned forward in their seats, with their slit-pupilled eyes wide and focused. Every single being in the fractured nebula was staring at the same thing. A human woman, small and soft and supposedly harmless, holding a Drawl mercenary face down on a bar counter, with a joint lock that should not have been physically possible given the size difference. Gorvek thrashed and snarled and tried to push himself up, and Mara adjusted her grip and increased the pressure, and something in his shoulder made a wet popping sound that made several patrons wince. "Stay down," she said, and her voice had not changed, still calm, still low, still carrying no anger and no fear, and that was somehow the most terrifying part. One of Gorvek's crew, a Drawl with a scar across his snout and fury in his yellow eyes, charged at her from the left, claws raised, jaws open, 300 pounds of armored muscle moving at full sprint. Mara released Gorvek and turned to face the charge. The scarred Drawl came at her like a freight shuttle with teeth, and Mara did not try to meet his strength with her own, because she was not stupid, and she had been fighting things bigger than her for her entire adult life, and the first rule she had ever learned was simple: never fight the enemy they want you to fight. Make them fight the enemy they do not understand. She dropped low, grabbed a metal bar stool by the legs, and swung it upward into the charging Drawl's jaw, with every ounce of force her hips and shoulders and back could generate in one explosive rotation. The stool shattered against his scales, and the Drawl staggered sideways, not hurt badly, but stunned. Stunned because no species in his experience weaponized furniture. Stunned because the attack had come from an angle he did not expect. Stunned because the small soft creature was not running. She was advancing. The second Drawl came from her right, and this one was smarter. Then strike her, reaching with both massive clawed hands to pin her arms against her body, the way Drawl subdued smaller opponents. But Mara had seen that technique in the first 2 seconds of the fight, when Gorvek had reached for the Velny traders, and she had already filed it away in the part of her brain that catalogued threats the way other people catalogued groceries. She twisted sideways, let his hands close on empty air, drove her elbow into the soft tissue under his arm, where Drawl's scales were thinner. And when he flinched and dropped his guard, she slammed the heel of her palm upward into his throat. He went down choking. Ambassador Scythan pushed his chair back from his table without realizing he was doing it. 2 more Drawl rushed her at the same time, and this was where it got bad, because Mara could not dodge 2 walls of muscle coming from opposite directions, and the one on the left caught her with a sweeping claw strike across her ribs that opened 3 deep gashes through her jacket and into the skin beneath, and the pain was immediate and bright and hot, and Mara felt her vision flash white for a quarter of a second. She did not stop. This was the part that every alien in the bar would remember later, when they tried to explain what they had seen to people who had not been there. This was the part that would show up in every analysis, and every training lecture, and every terrified late-night conversation between species who had never thought about humans as anything more than background noise. She did not stop. The claws had torn through skin and muscle along her left side, and blood was soaking through her jacket in a spreading dark stain. And any Velny would have collapsed from the shock, and any Korvathi would have gone rigid with pain paralysis, and even Arithian, fast and lethal as they were, would have retreated to assess the wound, because that was what rational creatures did when they were injured. They pulled back. They protected themselves. They calculated whether continued fighting was worth the risk. Mara's body flooded with adrenaline, and the pain became a distant thing, not gone, not ignored, but moved to a shelf in the back of her mind where she could deal with it later. And her pupils dilated, and her heart rate spiked, and her muscles received a chemical command that her species had been perfecting for 200,000 years on a brutal little planet called Earth. Keep going. She grabbed the Drawl who had clawed her by the wrist, pulled him off balance, and drove her knee into the side of his leg, where the joint bent backward, and he howled and dropped. And she was already spinning to face the other one, already picking up a broken chair leg from the floor, already adjusting her stance to account for the wound on her left side that was making her breathing shallow. The other Drawl swung at her head, and she ducked under it and hit him across the face with the chair leg 3 times in rapid succession. Not hard enough to crack his scales, but hard enough to stun, hard enough to make him blink, hard enough to buy her the half-second she needed to step behind him and lock her arm around his throat and squeeze. Drawl had thick necks, layered with muscle and protected by overlapping scales, but the blood still flowed through arteries, and those arteries could still be compressed. And Mara knew exactly where they were because she was a medic, and she had spent 12 years learning the anatomy of every species she might need to save. Now she was using that knowledge in reverse. The Drawl thrashed and clawed at her arm, opening shallow cuts along her forearm, but she held on, teeth gritted, muscles screaming, blood from her ribs dripping onto the floor. And she held on for 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds, until his movements slowed, and his knees buckled, and he went down heavy and unconscious, and she released him, and stood up, and turned to face the next one. Pelith, the Korvathi aide, had pulled up the Galactic Archive on his datapad with shaking hands, and was scrolling through old files, ancient files, files from the First Contact era that most people never bothered to read. And on the screen was footage from a place called Earth. Footage of humans running across open grasslands for hours and hours, chasing animals that were faster than them. Animals that sprinted and stopped, and sprinted and stopped. And every time the animal stopped, the humans were still coming, still running, still closing the distance with that relentless patient stride that never sped up and never slowed down. Persistence predators. That was what humans had called themselves, and Pelith was beginning to understand that it was not a boast and not a metaphor. It was a description, and it was accurate. And the thing about persistence predators was that they did not need to be the fastest or the strongest or the most dangerous thing in any single moment. They just needed to be the thing that was still standing at the end. Mara fought the fifth Drawl with a metal serving tray she had picked up from the floor, using it as a shield when he slashed at her, then swinging its edge into the soft tissue of his inner elbow, then throwing it spinning into the face of the sixth Drawl who was trying to flank her. And she was bleeding from half a dozen wounds now, and her left hand was swelling where 2 fingers had broken when the fourth Drawl had stomped on it, and her breathing was ragged and wet, and she was pretty sure at least one rib was cracked. She was smiling, not a happy smile, a survival smile, a smile made of adrenaline and pain and the deep ancient knowledge that she was still alive and still fighting, and that was all that mattered. And the Drawl saw that smile, and something cold moved behind their eyes, because they had fought many species across many worlds, and they had never seen anything smile while bleeding this much. The sixth Drawl hesitated. Mara did not. She closed the distance before he could decide what to do, swept his leading leg out from under him with a low kick that she had no business being able to land against a creature that outweighed her by 300 pounds, but landed anyway, because he had shifted his weight wrong for just a fraction of a second. And as he stumbled, she jumped, actually jumped, onto his back, and locked both arms around his head and twisted. He went down. The seventh Drawl grabbed her from behind, both massive arms wrapping around her torso, claws digging into her shoulders, squeezing with a force that should have ended it right there, because a Drawl's grip strength could crush industrial piping. And Mara felt her ribs scream, and her vision narrow, and her lungs compress, until breathing became a war she was losing. She did the thing that made every alien in the room recoil in visceral horror. Turned her head, and she bit down, hard, with the full force of a human jaw that could generate over 150 pounds of pressure per square inch, into the soft tissue between the scales on the inside of his forearm, where the hide was thin and the nerves were close to the surface. The Drawl screamed, a sound none of them had ever heard a Drawl make before, and his grip loosened for just a second, and Mara ripped herself free and staggered forward, blood on her mouth that was not hers, and she turned and faced him, and he backed away from her with something in his eyes that looked very much like fear. Gorvek had pulled himself up from the bar counter. He was the last one standing, and he looked around the room at his crew, groaning on the floor, unconscious, clutching broken joints, one of them still pawing at the bite wound on his arm with an expression of stunned disbelief. And then he looked at the human. She was a wreck, bleeding from her ribs, her arms, her bodies, shoulders, standing with a slight lean to the left because of the cracked rib, her broken fingers hanging at a wrong angle, her chest heaving, her jacket soaked dark and heavy. But she was standing, and she was looking at him, and she was waiting. Gorvek was Drawl, and Drawl did not retreat, and Drawl did not know fear, and Drawl had conquered worlds, and broken armies, and ruled through strength for 10,000 years. Gorvek stepped backward. He stepped backward again, and then he turned and walked out of the bar without a word. Mara watched him go. Then her knees buckled for just a moment, and she caught herself on a table, and breathed. 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3, and the adrenaline was crashing now, and the pain was coming back like a tide, and she could feel every wound, and every break, and every torn piece of herself all at once. She straightened up. She walked back to her booth. The bar looked like a shuttle crash site. Tables were overturned and broken. Chairs were scattered in pieces across the floor. The counter had a crack running through its center, where Gorvek's face had met it, and there was blood on the floor. Mostly human blood, which was a deep, dark red that none of the alien species in the room had seen in that quantity before, and which seemed to be everywhere, smeared on surfaces, and pooling in the gaps between floor plates, and soaking into the fabric of the booth where Mara had sat back down as if nothing had happened. 7 Brawl mercenaries were on the floor in various states of damage. 1 unconscious, 2 groaning and holding broken joints, 1 still touching the bite mark on his arm, with an expression of someone whose entire understanding of the universe had just been rearranged, and the rest sitting very still and staring at nothing, with the particular blank look of creatures who were trying to figure out what had just occurred, and how it had occurred, and whether it could please stop occurring. Mara sat in her booth, and her hands were shaking, not from fear, from the adrenaline leaving her system, which was a chemical process she had been through enough times to recognize and hate, because the crash was always worse than the fight, always left her feeling hollowed out and fragile, and painfully aware of every place her body had been damaged. She looked at her left hand and saw that her ring finger and middle finger were bent at angles that fingers were not supposed to bend at, and she reached into the medkit she kept in her jacket pocket, because she always kept a medkit in her jacket pocket, had done so for 20 years, would probably do so until the day she died, and she set the fingers with quick, practiced motions, and splinted them with auto-setting medical tape, and did not make a sound while she did it. Tillis had pulled himself up from the floor. The little Velny's jaw was swollen, and his light was still dim. But he was moving, limping behind the bar on shaking legs, and he looked at the destruction around him, and then he looked at Mara, and his compound eyes were so wide that the light behind them seemed to glow from a deeper place than usual. He poured a glass of whiskey with trembling hands, and carried it to Mara's booth, and set it down in front of her, without saying a word, because his jaw was fractured, and talking hurt, but also because he was not sure any words existed in any language for what he had just witnessed. Mara looked at the glass, and then up at Tillis, and the corner of her mouth moved in something that was almost a smile. "Pour yourself one too," she said. "On me." Tillis went back to the bar, and poured himself a glass of something Velny, and brought it to her booth, and sat down across from her, and they drank together in silence, while the bar slowly began to make noise again around them. Quiet at first, whispers and murmurs, and the Velny sound of chairs being righted and glass being swept up, and then louder as people began to talk about what they had seen and what it meant. Station security arrived 19 minutes after the fight ended. A squad of 4 officers came through the door with weapons drawn, led by a Gorath security chief named Borak, who was built like a cargo container with 4 arms and a face that suggested he had seen everything the station had to offer and was tired of all of it. He stopped 3 steps inside the door. He looked at the 7 Drawl on the floor, 7 Drawl, each one capable of tearing a security officer apart with their bare hands. And then he looked at the human woman sitting in a corner booth drinking whiskey with a Velny bartender, and he slowly and very deliberately holstered his weapon. "Someone want to tell me what happened here?" he asked. 12 different species started talking at once. Borak listened to about 30 seconds of overlapping testimony, and then held up 2 of his 4 hands for silence, and walked over to Mara's booth, and stood there looking down at her with an expression that was halfway between professional assessment and personal disbelief. "You did this?" he asked. Mara took a sip of her whiskey. "They started it," she said. Borak stared at her for a long moment, and then nodded once, and turned to his officers, and told them to process the drawl for assault and extortion, and to get medical teams in here for everyone who needed them. And as he walked away, Mara heard him mutter something in Gorathi that she did not understand, but that made his officers look back at her with wide eyes. Ambassador Sithon appeared at her table. The Korvathi diplomat had not moved from his seat during the entire fight, had not lifted a finger, had not called for help, had not done anything at all except watch. And now he stood beside Mara's booth, with his iridescent scales shifting through colors. that she could not read, but that Telis could, and Telis's light pulsed a sharp, surprised yellow, because the colors on Sithon's scales were the Korvathi equivalent of deep unease. "May I sit?" Sithon asked. Mara gestured at the seat across from her, and Sithon folded his serpentine body into the booth with a grace that seemed practiced and automatic, like a reflex he used when his mind was busy with something else. "That was remarkable," he said, and his silk-smooth voice had a crack in it that had not been there before. "That was Tuesday," Mara said. Sithon studied her face for a long moment, the calm eyes, the steady breathing, the blood drying on her jacket and arms, and then he asked the question that had been building in him since the moment she put Gorvek's face through the counter. "What military rank did you hold?" "Sergeant," Mara said. "What branch? Special Operations? Assault Infantry? Orbital Drop?" "Medical Corps," Mara said. "I was a combat medic. I mostly patched people up." Sithon's scales went through 3 colors in rapid succession and settled on one that Telis had never seen before, a deep mottled gray that his species used when they were confronted with information that fundamentally challenged their assumptions about how the universe worked. A combat medic. Not a warrior, not a commando, not the best humanity had to offer in the arena of violence. A field doctor, a healer, someone whose primary job had been to keep other people alive. And she had just dismantled 7 of the most physically dangerous creatures in the bar with her bare hands and improvised weapons, while bleeding from wounds that would have incapacitated most other species. The implication of what that meant about actual human soldiers sat between them like a live explosive. Sithon excused himself without another word and returned to his table where Pelith was, still staring at his datapad, scrolling through old Galactic Archive files with the frantic energy of someone who had just realized they had been living next to something they did not understand. The security footage from the fractured nebula leaked onto the Galactic Information Network within 6 hours. It should not have. Station security was supposed to secure all surveillance records as evidence. But someone copied the file and uploaded it to a public server, and from there, it spread the way all things spread on a network that connected 10,000 worlds, instantly and unstoppably. Within 12 hours, the footage had been viewed 400 million times across 17 different species networks. Within 24 hours, it was being analyzed. On a Rithian military academy world called Kes Torath, a combat instructor named Veshon played the footage for her advanced class, and paused it at the moment Mara adapted her fighting style, between the 2nd and 3rd drawl. "Watch her eyes," Veshon told her students. "She sees the attack pattern once, and then she knows it. Watch how she changes her stance, her timing, her target selection. This is not instinct. This is real-time tactical processing at a level we do not train for, because we have never needed to, because we are fast enough to not need it." She paused and let that settle over her students. "This is why the old treaties exist," she said. "This is why the founders of the Galactic Compact made very sure the humans were invited to the table and not left outside it, because the alternative was finding out what happens when you give a persistence predator a reason to come after you." On the Drawl homeworld of Goroth Ken, an elder named Taurus received the footage through a military intelligence channel and watched it 7 times in silence, and then forwarded it to the Drawl Military Council with a single annotation: "They have not changed." Korvathi Diplomatic Archives. A historian named Sevoth pulled a file that had not been accessed in 80 years, a document from the First Contact era titled Assessment of Species 4417H, Terran Humans, that contained a single recommendation highlighted in the archive equivalent of red. Recommend immediate inclusion in all trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. Under no circumstances should this species be given cause for organized hostility. See attached combat analysis. environmental adaptation data, and historical conflict records for detailed justification. The attached records ran to 14,000 pages. Mara knew none of this. She sat in her booth and drank her whiskey and let the station medics who eventually arrived clean and seal the gashes on her ribs and wrap her cracked rib in a compression bandage and scan her broken fingers to make sure the splints were set correctly. And the medics, who were Velny, kept looking at her with an expression that combined medical concern with something that looked very much like awe, because her wounds were serious, and she was sitting there, discussing the quality of the whiskey with Tillis, as if she had done nothing more strenuous than rearrange furniture. When the medics were finished, she thanked them, and stood up carefully, and put enough credits on the table to cover the damage to the bar and her drinks, and walked out into the station corridor and back to her ship. She did not look back. 3 weeks passed, and the galaxy did what the galaxy always did with things that frightened it. It talked. The footage from the fractured nebula had become one of the most viewed recordings in the history of the Galactic Information Network, surpassing First Contact archives and wartime broadcasts, and even the famous footage of the Rithian fleet engagement at Kelos Nebula that had held the top position for 11 years. It was not the violence that made people watch it again and again. The galaxy had plenty of violence, had entire channels dedicated to combat sports and military history, and the brutal territorial disputes that flared up between species every few decades like clockwork. It was the getting back up. Every species that watched the footage came back to the same moment, the same image, the same impossible stubborn fact. The human took a claw strike across the ribs that opened her flesh to the bone, and she did not stop, did not retreat, did not do any of the things that any rational creature would do when its body was torn open, and instead she smiled and kept fighting, and won. Commentators across a dozen species networks tried to explain it in terms their audiences would understand. A Korvathi behavioral scientist called it a catastrophic failure in self-preservation instinct, and was immediately corrected by a human xenobiologist who pointed out that it was not a failure at all. It was a feature, a deliberate evolutionary adaptation, a chemical system built over millions of years that allowed humans to suppress pain and fear and physical limitation during moments of extreme stress, and continue functioning at near full capacity long past the point where their bodies should have shut down. The Korvathi scientist asked how long a human could sustain this state. The human xenobiologist said it depended on the individual, but some had been documented fighting for hours with injuries that should have killed them. Others had been documented walking for days on broken legs to reach safety. And others had been documented surviving in environments so hostile that the mere description of them made the Korvathi scientist's scales go pale. The interview was watched 300 million times and did not make anyone feel better. On station Cathara 9, things changed quickly and visibly. Gorvek's crew left within 48 hours of the fight, not because station security forced them out, but because the footage had made them famous in a way that no mercenary wanted to be famous. Because every potential employer and every potential target had now seen them get dismantled by a single unarmed human who was not even a soldier, and their reputation as fearsome enforcers was effectively over. Piracy in the surrounding sector dropped by 40% in the 3 weeks following the incident, and station administrators across the region reported a similar decline in protection rackets, docking fee scams. And when analysts tried to identify the cause, they kept coming back to the same simple explanation. The footage was circulating, and every petty warlord, and every small-time thug, and every bully with claws and armor and a bad attitude had watched it, and had quietly decided that maybe it was better to not find out if the next human they pushed around would push back. Tilos became something of a celebrity. The small Velny bartender gave interviews to galactic media outlets from behind his repaired bar counter, his jaw healed, but still slightly swollen, his bioluminescence bright and animated as he spoke about that night. And every interviewer asked him the same question. What was it like to watch a human fight? And every time he gave the same answer. She checked if I was okay first, he said. Before the fighting, before anything, she came to me, and she knelt down and she checked my injuries, and she told me I was going to be okay. And she meant it. That is the part that nobody talks about. And I think that is the part that matters most. The interviewers always wanted to talk about the violence, the broken drawl, the bite, the smile through the blood. But Tillis kept bringing them back to that moment. The moment before the first punch. The moment when a human woman walked across a bar full of frightened people and knelt beside a broken stranger and chose to heal before she chose to fight. It was such a small thing, and it was everything. Ambassador Sithon returned to the Korvathi homeworld and requested an emergency diplomatic session with the Terran Confederation Embassy. A request that raised eyebrows across the diplomatic corps, because the Korvathi had not requested a direct session with humans in over 30 years, having long since decided that humanity was too minor a power to warrant high-level engagement. His internal memo, which was leaked to the press 2 weeks later by a source inside his own administration, was the catalyst that revealed what had really changed. Delegation contained a single paragraph that became the most quoted diplomatic text of the year. We have made the error of mistaking human restraint for human weakness, and this error has been compounded over generations of interaction, during which humanity has been cooperative and peaceful, and has given us no reason to remember what they are capable of when they choose not to be cooperative and peaceful. This must be corrected at the policy level immediately, because the alternative is continuing to operate under an assumption that a single retired medic in a bar on a fringe station has proven to be catastrophically wrong. The Galactic Threat Index was updated for the first time in 12 years. Humanity was moved from Tier 4, low-moderate cooperative, to Tier 2, high, exercise caution, and the reclassification was approved unanimously by all 18 member species of the Galactic Security Council, which had not unanimously agreed on anything in over a century. And the speed of the approval told its own story about how many of those species had been privately worried about exactly this for a very long time. The new entry read, "Species demonstrates extreme persistence under physical duress, rapid tactical adaptation, high pain tolerance, and a documented capacity for exponential threat escalation. Approach with caution and maintain cooperative diplomatic relations at all times. See Kethera 9 Incident Report for reference." Mara Ihejirika knew almost none of this. She was 3 systems away from Kethera 9, running a medical supply route to fringe colonies on the Outer Rim, the same route she had been running for the past 4 years, because the colonies needed medicine and nobody else wanted to make the long haul through the empty lanes between stars, where the fuel was expensive and the pay was modest, and the only company was the hum of the engines and the black. Her ship was called the Quiet Mercy, battered freighter that she had bought with her military pension and repaired with her own hands, and filled with crates of antibiotics and surgical supplies and field medkits that she delivered to clinics on worlds that the major powers had forgotten about, because forgetting about people was something the galaxy was very good at, and Mara had decided a long time ago that she was not going to be good at it. She sat in the pilot's seat with a bandage around her ribs, and her splinted fingers resting carefully on the console. And she made a subspace call to her daughter on Earth, a delayed signal call that would take 8 minutes to reach and 8 minutes to return, which meant every conversation was an exercise in patience and faith that the words you sent would still matter by the time they arrived. "Hey baby," she said, "I am about 2 days out from Velnus 3. The weather is supposed to be nice there, if you can believe that a planet full of bugs has weather reports. Are terrible, but when are they not? I miss you and I will try to call again when I have a better signal." She did not mention the fight. She did not mention the 7 drawl, or the cracked rib, or the broken fingers, or the scars that were still healing along her ribs, because her daughter worried enough already, and because Mara had never been the kind of person who made a story out of her own pain. She ended the call and checked her cargo manifest and adjusted her heading and flew on into the dark between stars. 6,000 light-years away, on a station that Mara had never visited and would probably never visit, a young alien walked into a bar. He was Craven, tall, four-armed, armored along the spine, and full of the particular confidence that came with being 20 years old and strong, and convinced that the universe was a place that would bend around him if he pushed hard enough. There was a human at the bar, a freighter pilot, average height, average build. Nothing remarkable about him at all, just a man drinking a beer and reading something on a datapad. The young Craven had been drinking for 3 hours, and he was looking for a reason to prove himself, and the human seemed like the easiest reason available, so he walked up and knocked the beer off the counter and said something insulting about soft-skinned species. The human put down his datapad and stood up. He was not tall, and he was not wide, and he did not have claws, or armor, or scales, or venom, or any of the things that the galaxy considered dangerous. Every other alien in the bar immediately pushed their chairs back and cleared a wide circle around the two of them, moving with a speed and urgency that had nothing to do with the Craven and everything to do with the human. The young Craven looked around at the empty space that had suddenly appeared, and the fear on the faces of patrons who had been perfectly relaxed a moment ago, and he felt the first cold needle of confusion pierced his confidence. An old Gorath who had been sitting near the door leaned over from his table and spoke in a voice that carried across the sudden silence. "Sit down, boy," the old Gorath said. "You have not seen the video yet." The young Craven looked at the human. The human looked back at him with calm, steady eyes and an expression of quiet patience that suggested he was perfectly willing to finish his beer in peace, but equally willing to do something else if peace was not an option. The young Craven sat down. Outside the bar, outside the station, outside the small bright bubbles of civilization that clung to rocks and metal frames in the endless dark, the galaxy turned and hummed and carried on the way it always had, vast and old, and full of species who built empires and lost them, and forgot the lessons they had learned, and learned them again the hard way. The galaxy was very old, and it forgot many things. Some lessons, once relearned, tend to stick.